It's nice to see you here, all here today. I can see the numbers are still going up, so we'll just give the waiting room a few more minutes. Not a few more minutes, a minute or so. Okay, it looks like the numbers have stabilized. Hi, everyone. My name is Jennifer Ruskin, and I am here with you from Macquarie University and also as the co-chair of the Professional Learning Committee of WIL Australia. And it is an absolute pleasure to welcome you all here today. And I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which each of us is for this meeting. For me, in my case, that is the Guringai lands, the beautiful Guringai lands. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and to invite all of you, if you would like to post to the chat the lands from which you are joining. We can acknowledge the countries where we all are. So the purpose of today's event is actually, I should just take a moment to acknowledge that this is the first event of WIL Australia for 2026, and it is an absolute pleasure to have this event in particular and to welcome all of you and get our year kicked off in late February. And we'll have a year of events coming, more on that toward the end. The purpose of today is to explore assurance of learning in WIL, and specifically a peer review as a model for supervised WIL assessment. The format is really a conversation between our two speakers, who I will introduce in just a moment, and we will do our very best to save some time to get to any questions that you have. So that we can do that, I will ask you to post any questions you have to the chat as we go along, and then when there is space, we'll put your questions in. And with that, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce our two speakers for today. We have Associate Professor Faith Valencia-Forrester. She is academic lead, work integrated learning at Charles Sturt University. Her peer review model for supervised WIL assessment enables students to present their WIL experiences to cross-disciplinary peer groups for structured feedback and evaluation. Her work in this space is published in Assessment and Evaluation in Higher Education.
Thanks, Jen.
I would also like to welcome Professor Mollie Dollinger. She is the Director of Assessment 2030 at Curtin University, where she leads a whole of university strategy for assessment transformation. Her work centers on supporting educational innovation, and her research focuses on students' voice, graduate employability, and student equity. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to both Faith and Mollie. And to get things started, I will turn it over to Mollie to help us set the scene and understand the challenges associated with assurance of learning. Over to you, Mollie.
Thanks so much, Jen, and thanks both to Jen and Faith for inviting me to speak today. So I'm gonna share my screen, which we tested, and hopefully it works. Can everybody see it? Yes, that's good. All right, so I thought I'd do the provocative title of what are we going to do about WIL? I think Faith has some solutions to this that she'll discuss in her presentation, but I suppose, in some ways this conversation is new and in some ways it's old. AI has changed sort of the environment and the background in which we're operating, but I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here when I say that WIL is incredibly important and it should continue to be a bedrock of the university experience for our students. We know our students love it. It's often where they get to see their professional identities come into full force. And it's really our goal in today, I think I speak for WIL Australia, to talk about how we preserve WIL moving forward and make it stronger than ever. So I thought I would start off with a bit of a timeline of the TEQSA advice, because I spend all my day thinking about Gen AI and assessment, but I appreciate that some of you might have other things on your mind. So just as a bit of a reminder for everyone, this all kind of kicked off in 2023, where Jason Lodge and colleagues published the first piece of advice, which was the assessment reform for the age of Gen AI or AI. What this document was, though, and if you go back, and I think there'll be a link to it today, is it's really just a set of guiding principles and propositions. And I suppose some of the criticism of the document was that it wasn't particularly prescriptive. It didn't set ground rules on what we must do or what we must not do. But I think that was actually really beneficial and purposeful, as we look back on it, because it was an incredibly scary and unknown time. And I think even if we look back at what we thought we knew in 2023, turns out a lot of things we didn't know. So I think it was quite forward thinking in the fact that it was more of a framework around thinking about our values, the purpose of higher education, and sort of what we want our graduates to look like at the end of their journey. And I think that educative approach then led to what is considered a really successful piece of work, which is where TEQSA asked every single institution to provide their institutional action plan related to generative AI. And if you've heard TEQSA speak about this before, almost every single provider in Australia provided this action plan. And look, they were to varying degrees of maturity, but I think it really speaks to the sector's understanding that this was very important and that every university needed to be moving forward and thinking about this. And so I think it was a really positive thing that everyone did participate. In 2025, though, we did start to get a little bit more concrete with the advice coming out. So TEQSA and Jason Lodge and colleagues published the second piece, which was called Enacting Assessment Reform. And that piece outlined what we now know as the three pathways to the assurance of learning, or thinking about learning across the program. So those three, just as a reminder, are that you can think about things in a programmatic way or a program-wide way. What are the program or the course learning outcomes? How do we secure or assure those? You can think about it at a unit level. So, I mean, very common, for example, the University of Melbourne, I believe, has a policy that says all units must have 50% secure assessment. So they're going more at a unit level rather than that program level. Or finally, there's a hybrid. So to give you an example, perhaps the first year would be at a unit level, everything is 50% secure, and then you move to sort of a program or a course level in years 2 and 3. I mean, I'm filling in the colors here. The document, if you go back and read it, is pretty broad brushstrokes as well, but those are sort of the pathways that each institution has to thinking about security across their assessment regimes. And of course, in all of this, what has emerged, in tandem with the two-lane approach, for those of you that know Danny Liu's work and the variations of that work, is that supervised assessment is become the dominant compliance strategy for which we think about the assurance of learning. And there are some variations on what supervised assessment means, and we don't all necessarily agree on it. And I think that conversation is really important, and that will continue to develop, and I'm sure Faith's going to cover that in her presentation as well. But what we do know in 2026 is that TEQSA has signaled a shift from that educative approach that they once had in 2023 to perhaps a more regulatory-led enforcement moving forward. So it is certainly time for us all to really be enacting that change and not just talking about it. So on that note, I want to just revisit the three most important regulatory anchors that we all hopefully know by heart. I'm joking there, but Higher Education Standards Framework has these three standards, which are very, very important. Now, there is some discussion that they might be updated, there might be new ones and things. I don't have a crystal ball, so I can't speak to that, but I think these are pretty future fit, if you ask me. The first one is that the methods of assessment are consistent with the learning outcomes being assessed. That's pretty straightforward. The second is that on completion of a course of study that students have demonstrated the learning outcomes. Again, that thinks about that security, how we know the student is who we think they are, and whether they can evidence that learning. And then the last one is pretty important, though doesn't get talked about as much, which is that preventative action is taken to mitigate foreseeable risks in academic integrity. So I think in many ways is my favorite standard of the three, because it's telling us that, yeah, you need to do these things. That's your job as an institution here in Australia, but also you need to do more than what we just tell you to do. You need to really think about your courses. You need to think about your culture, your environment, and think about whether you are taking that preventative action yourself as an institution. Because I think one of the things people often confuse TEQSA with is that, that it's their job to go through every line, every course, every assessment. We're institutions, many of us are universities, we're self-accrediting. It's our job to actually do that, and we should want to do that for our reputation and for the good of our students as well. So one of the things I want to talk to today, though, is that briefing paper that myself and colleagues came out with last year. It was about online courses, but it's applicable to all courses, where we really kind of unpack the assurance of learning. Because while assessment security gets the lion's share of attention, there's a lot more that goes into assurance of learning throughout a course. So you can look up that document, but what we talk about is that it's really based on these three foundations. So the first one, absolutely, is that robust, secure assessment practice. So again, confirming the student's identity, controlling the conditions. It's absolutely necessary, but not the only component. The second is a culture of academic integrity. So that's thinking about how we're supporting students to understand ethics, to understand appropriate Gen AI use, thinking about their identity, what they're going to be like when they go out into that workforce, which of course relates heavily to how they're going to be in WIL assessments and WIL placements. And it's also thinking about how we model that as educators who interact with students. And then the last one is certainly one that gets more attention these days than it ever did before, which is that valid and trustworthy assessment design. So you would know that Phil Dawson and myself and colleagues have talked a lot about assessment validity, which is really just a fancy way of saying, does this assessment measure what I think it's intended to measure, right? So sometimes with exams, what you really are measuring, I'm not saying exams are bad, but you're measuring their ability to recall knowledge. You're seeing whether they have that foundational knowledge, and that can be really useful, but it's not measuring their ability to necessarily translate that knowledge or to implement it in new contexts or scenarios, right? You would need a different type of assessment for that. So I think that's really thinking about that focus there. So all three, again, are needed across. And one of the things I want to point out quickly here is that there's a reason we don't have every assessment be secure. And people have written about this before, but if we had every assessment as secure, we actually wouldn't be teaching students what it's like to be independent, ethical, appropriate professionals in their future careers. So we don't want everything to be secure. We just want enough security to feel good that the student who's graduating knows what we think they know. So again, let's shift the focus here to WIL. So WIL is, of course, lots of different things. It's placements, it's online or virtual WIL, it's projects, it's simulations, and it's other types of activities, engaging with community or industry or so on. So all of these activities, depending on their design, one could argue, could either be secure or open or non-secure assessments. It simply depends sort of on how they're designed. So as a last slide here before I hand over to Faith, I'm going to talk about how we do this at Curtin University in Assessment 2030. So this is how we distinguish WIL assessment at Curtin. The first question we ask, and this isn't just true of WIL, but it's true of all assessments, is the activity synchronously supervised? Because our definition of secure assessment here at Curtin, which we've put into our policy, is that it is a synchronously supervised assessment. So if so, then it immediately would map onto that two-lane framework in lane one. And we would argue that the placement itself can provide the assurance. So For us, and this is a little bit different than for other universities, if the assessment is linked to a supervised synchronous placement, we accept the entirety of it as a secure assessment. So, for example, they might have to do a reflective essay on their clinical placement, but we would consider that secure even if the essay was, so to speak, independently produced, because the placement itself provides us that assurance of learning. Then, if it's not synchronous supervised, does it at least provide a secure assessment component? So this could be, again, going back to synchronous supervision, things like live presentations, debates, FIVAs, and so on. So again, then that would mark to a secure. So there's two different routes, so to speak, to get to that lane 1. Everything else then falls into non-secure or lane 2. But as you'll see on the slide there, I don't want anyone thinking that just because it's non-secure, that it's lesser. So because again, we don't want necessarily to secure everything. And the purpose of lane 2 is very different because it's about modeling that independent ability to be able to go out into the workplace and make ethical judgments and act appropriately in your role. So we do want to scaffold that across the course for students as well. So that's our little snapshot of it, but I'll hand over to Faith, who I think will give us a more in-depth example.
Thanks, Molly. I am just going to share my screen. And I suppose I should start my presentation, shouldn't I? There we go. I'd just like to it's asking me if I need to let multiple partners share. Okay. Thanks, Molly. Before I get started, I'd like to quickly acknowledge that we are gathering on traditional lands and pay my respects to traditional owners, elders, custodians, and elders past and present. And I'd also just like to acknowledge that I'm joining from beautiful Kabi Kabi country, and I'm grateful to give this acknowledgement today and acknowledge that this land has never been ceded. And an acknowledgement is not just ceremonial. It's about people coming together to do business. And Wiradjuri woman Tracy Ryan shared that with me. So I do like to acknowledge that we're all here to learn about will and assurance of learning. And Molly, you did a fabulous job outlining the assurance of learning challenge beautifully. So I've got the opportunity to ground this in a specific will case study. And I just want to start off by saying that the way we came to develop this model had nothing to do with compliance or TEQSA requirements. Basically, it came down to budget. We were blowing out our tutorial budget because we had our will students coming back and doing, I guess you'd call them interactive orals. They would do a small presentation to a tutor and a small group of their peers. And where our traditional tutorial times were originally 2 hours, when it came time to do our assessment, they were blowing out to 6 and 8 hours, and scheduling itself was a complete nightmare. So we were directed to reduce our casual budget, but we also wanted to make sure that we did this in a way that provided quality, authentic learning experiences for our students. We did not want to be driven by budget, even though we were, but we did want to make sure that students had an enjoyable, authentic assessment experience. So how we developed it is we suggested we looked at peer learning. Now, we iterated this model over 6 semesters. And each time that we delivered the model, we were making adjustments. And I'll put my hand up first. And I was like I'm a little bit confused about how this is going to work, because I thought all the students are just going to give everybody high distinctions and great mark. And I was actually surprised how rigorous students actually were in their marking of their peers. So when TEQSA started talking about assurance of learning and security of learning, that's when I realized that, hey, hang on a second. Our peer review model actually aligns with a lot of these compliance demands, being direct observation, identity verification, and that real-time assessment. So this is where we started looking at the peer review model and mapping it against the TEQSA requirements, where we started going, oh, hang on a second, this actually fits. I don't know how to move on to the next slide. There we go. So just to give you some background, we were originally doing oral presentations with our students. But if you think about the gold standard of secure assessment, and that's invigilated exams. So we kind of took some of that modeling and took the written exam component out of it. And we looked at authentic practice. What do students do? They present in the workplace in small groups. They share about their work experience and they collaborate with their peers on challenges, reflections. So that was really the basis of what we were trying to do with this assessment, is we wanted to make sure that there was that authentic professional practice at the heart of it. So supervised will assessments meant that the individual presentations took far too long for one academic supervisor, but we were having cohorts of nearly 200 students. So this is where we were trying to match our resources with our cohort requirements, and how do we make sure that students are actually getting some learning out of these experiences. So we were looking at around 50 to 20 hours of assessment per tutor, and we had to get that budget down. So what we were doing wasn't scaling. So what do we do? We looked at individual vivas. They were resource intensive. The invigilated exams, they don't assess professional capability. Written reflection only at the time was a great way for WIL in terms of it was a core ingredient of work integrated learning. And AI development started bringing in authentication challenges. So we were looking at maybe we just reduce this assessment altogether. But the underlying assumption is all of these was that supervision and authenticity are competing demands that require certain trade-offs. But we were looking at this as how could we have supervision, reduce our budget, and enhance the authentic experience of the student rather than constrain it. So we decided we'd take a different approach. So we have the students presenting to their peers in small groups during the tutorial time. It's supervised because the tutor is constantly circulating continually. They're observing the groups in real time. Sometimes the tutor will contribute, they'll ask questions of the students, but they're observing the students presenting, and they're also observing how the other students are engaging in those groups. So we're looking at cross-disciplinary groups. Now, we were working in a multidiscipline unit. We had undergraduate and postgraduate students working from a variety of disciplines, but it works in single discipline instances as well, because students generally are having their placements in different organizations, and those experiences differ in the challenges and the experiences of those students. So again, we weren't looking at what the students were doing. We were looking at what they could bring to these presentations and how we could mirror actual workplace activities. It's not a simulation. They're not simulating a work practice. They're actually engaging in work practice. It was scalable. We were able to maintain all of our cohort within our tutorial time allocation. We didn't have to go through do room bookings, and students were learning from diverse WIL contexts, and they were also developing their evaluative judgment. So the structure is pretty straightforward. We had small groups between 2 to 5 students. We deliberately mixed the disciplines and the undergraduate and postgraduate students because we wanted a range of experiences. Each student presented their WIL experience, and it was framed around a challenge or a particular experience that they needed to reflect on and present back to the group. And then the peer questions had to probe and clarify. So the peers were completing their evaluations using a structured form, but it was the why that matters pedagogically. So I'm just going to show you how this meets TEQSA requirements. There's continuous tutor presence. They have systematic circulation and real-time observation of all presentations at the same time. The real-time presentations with spontaneous peer questioning. So the students who haven't genuinely engaged cannot elaborate under that questioning. There's also academic integrity is through structured protocols, the tutor moderation of all the evaluations, and the authority to adjust the grades. Students are told right at the beginning, it's the tutor that provides the grade, but your peers' grading informs the tutor's marking. And in terms of quality assurance, we had consistent criteria and standardized briefing and documentation moderation for students. So this aligned with HESF 1.4, 5.3, and 5.4 on assessment integrity through supervisors. So there was 4 learning mechanisms. It's not just, it turned out that it wasn't just a logistical solution to our budget issues. It activated 4 interconnected learning mechanisms that traditional WIL assessment doesn't normally achieve in real time. So students are developing their evaluative judgment. They're having exposure to diverse quality across contexts. It's authentic practice. They're developing their presentation. They're also developing their collaboration, and they're developing their engagement skills. It's a genuine professional peer evaluation. There's also spontaneous articulation where they're engaged in real-time professional learning, and they're also having to critically think and reflect on their experience to answer the questions. It also has cross-disciplinary translation, so it's got boundary crossing skills, and I'll unpack these quickly. I'm going to rush through these. I'm sorry I'm taking up so much time. Now, with regards evaluative judgment development, this is students' capability to make decisions about quality. Now, it's about their own work and the quality work of others. Traditional WIL assessment means students only reflect on their own experiences. There's no systemic comparison with how their peers articulate their learning. The cross-disciplinary peer review changes this. So students must apply professional standards to unfamiliar industry contexts. They learn to distinguish superficial from substantive claims, and the cross-disciplinary context is essential. Students cannot rely on shared jargon, forcing articulation in transferable terms. They need to reflect on their own experience and in a comparison to other people's experience. In terms of authentic professional practice, this is critical. It's not simulating professional practice. This is what students will be doing in their professional practice. Professionals regularly present to their colleagues, receive peer feedback, they evaluate peer work, and the model replicates these authentic activities. Our colleagues are not our judges. We're framing it and reducing student anxiety by presenting it as this is what you will do in profession. You're developing your professional skills. And as we know with authentic assessment, students get more value out of assignments and assessment activities where they see it has application in practical contexts within their careers. So we're helping reduce their anxiety while we're maintaining our academic rigor and replicating exactly how workplace peer reviews work. There's that spontaneous professional articulation. This is where the written reflection allows extensive preparation and editing, but when they're on the spot and their peers are questioning them about their experience, they have to demonstrate their critical thinking, their critical engagement with their experiences, and they need to respond to unexpected questions. They need to defend their choices and demonstrate depth through the examples that they draw on. They can't just punch it into AI, say, I did this, this, and this, and have a reflection presented for them. They actually have to physically reflect in real time and answer peer questioning. So it serves a dual function. It develops their professional articulation skills while simultaneously authenticating workplace claims. So I'll give you an example. When I was circulating, I was listening to one student who was presenting very well prepared. They had presentation artifacts, they had a PowerPoint, they presented very well. And one of the students asked them, they said, can you give me a specific example of where you used that skill? And it was interesting because the student couldn't come up with concrete details about how they'd actually used that skill. So the peer scores for that particular presenter were lower than the other presentations. And my observations have confirmed this with other students asking questions around their peers. So this has been demonstrated consistently across the peer groups. And workplace problems don't align with single disciplines. If you're working in radiology, you are not just dealing with radiologists. You're dealing with nurses, doctors, wardsmen, patients from all different disciplines. So professional practice requires boundary crossing capabilities. And the cross-disciplinary peer evaluation requires translating discipline-specific experiences into broader competencies. So this is where we're recognizing common principles across diverse contexts. One student was asking also with another student, a biomed student, and they asked them, how would that work in a non-for-profit context? So this forced that student to actually take what they had learned and what they were reflecting on and adjust that response and apply it in a different context. You can never know what kind of questions students are going to ask, but this forces that sophisticated understanding of universal versus context-dependent principles. Now, the most important element of this model is the student briefing. I'm sure you all know student anxiety around assessment. How you brief the students about this experience is critical. The first time when we were really not so sure ourselves, I don't think we put as much into the briefing and students had a high level of anxiety. But through multiple iterations, we started realizing that if we gave students a pretty good expectation of what the process was, we articulated it as professional experience, and we were able to share previous students' experience about the assessment. It really did a lot to help calm them down and better prepare them for the experience. What was great about this is we got student feedback about their experience, and it was overwhelmingly positive. They shared that they were highly anxious before going into the assessment, but after, when they reflected back, that they found it really valuable and they enjoyed it immensely. So we were very careful to avoid framing it as peer grading or being assessed by their classmates. We framed it as, this is a collegial, professional discussion, and you'll be demonstrating your professional skills development. It reduced the student anxiety, and it also let them see that it was actually professional practice that they were engaging in. We explained why the cross-disciplinary allocations were, and why peers were working with different peers, because we explained in the real world context, you'll be working with lots of different people in professional contexts. And we were also very clear that the tutors were actually the ones marking the work, not their peers. We had groups as small as 2 right up to 5. Students would present in small groups, and each peer had to ask at least one question. So that's why we got them to write it down. And then they completed a structural evaluation form. That evaluation form went probably through, I'd say, 12 iterations, just trying to get that form right. And there's the examples in the paper, but I've developed a much simpler one that I'll put in the chat later. I don't know why we made it so complicated. But basically, once we got the hang of how to incorporate peer reviews into the tutor marking, it became a lot easier, and it also reduced our tutor marking time. Students would also submit their artifacts or their presentations. So it really gave our tutors and our academics a range of artifacts to draw their marks from. During the assessment, the tutor is definitely observing how everybody is doing their presentations, asking their questions. We'd take notes as we'd rotate around. Sometimes we'd join in, we'd ask our own questions, or we'd ask a peer. We'd say, well, why did you ask that question? So we were really engaging with the students while we were observing them. And then afterwards, we'd collect all the student review forms, we'd collect all the presentation artifacts, and then we do our own marking. So that critical principle is that the final grade determination rests with the tutor. That was made very clear. Now, I mentioned earlier that I was concerned about everybody marking everybody really easily. I was actually surprised at how rigorous students were. The grade distributions from the students followed our traditional interactive orals patterns. So students often marked more rigorously than the tutor. So the collegial framing doesn't mean that it's uncritical. And of course, I started out saying that we started off with budget. We had around about 6 hours of casual assessment during that time. We just got it back into the allocated 2-hour tutorial time. It didn't reduce our marking time, but there was definite assessment in the period of our tutor time. That was a 66% reduction in assessment. We didn't compromise on supervision or quality. It was sustainable and able to be scaled without proportional resource increases. And the assessment was contained within the existing timetable. Now, if anybody is wondering, how does this work online? Of course, COVID hit in 2020. So we did have to transition this model online, and we were concerned. However, what we did was the tutors would go in through the breakout rooms. Now, there wasn't that continual supervision, but the tutors were really rigorous in how they moved about the rooms and how they observed the presentations as they were occurring. Accessibility was an issue when we moved online. So what we would do is, for students who might have had an accessibility issue or who were very concerned about how they would participate in this environment, we would offer one-on-one opportunities for them. But once we would share about previous student experiences, many of them opted into the group experience. Limitations. This was just a single institutional research, and most of this was observation and iteration. There were some student resistance initially, though most of them converted after experiencing it. Like I said before, the form took multiple iterations to get right. We had probably up to 300 students that we ran this process through. You may need to make some adaptations for large cohorts over 1,000 students. Highly technical disciplines might need some procedural competencies for assessment, but we had biomeds, we had aero engineer students, we had business, creative industries, criminal justice students. We had multiple disciplines working together in the peer review model. So I can guarantee you that it does work and students enjoy it, but you'll need to adapt it to your own context. And like I said, online worked well. But the key takeaways is that just because TEQSA compliance and authentic assessments are now becoming regulatory, it doesn't mean that they're trade-offs. You can design and achieve both. Peer review develops professional skills, individual reflection cannot. Evaluative judgment, spontaneous articulation, cross-disciplinary translation. Resource efficiency is an amazing bonus, but I don't think that should be the driver behind the designing of this kind of assessment, but it is achievable without compromising rigor. And implementation matters. How you brief the students, how you use the form, the moderation, these details all determine how the model delivers. And there's a paper, I'll drop that into the chat. And if there's any questions, happy to answer them. Otherwise, looking forward to hearing more from Mollie.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to Mollie and to Faith for setting the scene, sharing the background on assurance of learning, and sharing your model that you've been working with, Faith. So we do have a few questions that are coming in on the chat, particularly to understand the model in more detail. But before we go there, I'd like to just open the conversation and ask Mollie if you can say a little bit about, now that you've heard about Faith's model, when you apply it to thinking about the assurance of learning challenges that you were trying to address. Can you comment on that a little bit, please?
So I think if we are too restrictive with what we consider security or supervision, we're going to box ourselves into a hole. So what I love about Faith's model and the rigor, behind it is that use of peer supervision. We've heard a lot of academics say that they're against peer supervision, that students collude with each other, that all sort of, mischievous behavior could be happening behind the scenes. That's probably true, but we know there's no such thing as a perfectly secure assessment. There's never going to be. And the goal is that Swiss cheese model, to have different types of assessment that sort of look for different things, that also look for different capabilities. It's more inclusive, it's more equitable to students as well that way. So I love Faith's model and the fact that it is really approaching that peer assessment as a key tool for us moving forward in the space.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing your thoughts on that. I just to add my 2 cents, I love the model as well, and my synapses are firing around how and where it might apply in my practice and in practice near me. So Faith, you mentioned at the beginning when you developed the model, you definitely were not thinking about how does this meet the TEQSA requirements. So I guess I'm wondering if you can say a little bit about how and why and when that came onto your radar.
Last year, actually, at our institution, obviously, we're all talking about assurance of learning, security, TEQSA requirements. And as I was listening to some of these discussions, and particularly when they were talking about Mollie's model, I was like, oh, hang on a second. My brain started going, our model aligns with TEQSA requirements. It aligns with what Mollie's saying in their paper. So I went back to all of my notes and reflections around that time, and I was able to pull out because we did a lot of observation and going back as a group of tutors, reflecting on what worked, what didn't, how do we make this better. Thankfully, I still had access to all of that information. And I originally prepared a paper for my institution with all the literature. And then I thought, you know what, I'm just going to write this up. And that's when the paper, I submitted it and they published it. And that's when I was like, hey, Mollie, look, do you want to, this kind of talks to what you're talking about. So no, it absolutely had nothing to do with TEQSA. Like I said, it was budget driven. I was being told to get my sessional budget down. So that was where it came from. But we wanted to keep the quality student experience and authentic assessment at the core of what we were going to do and how we were going to do it.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. I'm so glad that those connections started happening and that you put it in some formats where we can all benefit from your experience. So I'm going to turn to the chats for just a moment. And there are a few kind of how does the model work questions. So the first one is around, well, where does it apply? Did this occur in a generic will unit or something or did multiple disciplines somehow timetable the sessions together? How did that work?
No, this was a cross-disciplinary service learning unit. So it was a centrally administered unit. However, I would believe it has equal applicability in discipline-specific will units because students are not doing all their placements in the same place or in the same way. So that reflective element that they bring and share about their experience, no two placements are going to be exactly the same, and no two students' experiences are going to be, you're going to have small SMEs, you're going to have large corporate organizations, you're going to have great supervision on placement, you're going to have terrible supervision. There's so many opportunities for reflection on those experiences that I believe it could be effectively implemented in a single discipline will unit as well.
Excellent, thank you. And then there is another comment. I didn't acknowledge the first one, sorry. This is from Alicia Mitten. Thank you for the fantastic model. How do you manage students that can't attend the specific tutorial? They're sick, work reasons, etc. How do you manage that?
So then we'd have makeup tutorial, same as you would with any assessment. And this happened pretty much every session or semester. We would do a makeup session, and that's where you'd pull all the, I'm going to say, stragglers or people that we'd sort of schedule those a week or two after the assessment week. So we just redid that I had one student that had very severe anxiety, and it was that student testimonial of previous experiences because we ask student to reflect on the experience. And I would use those testimonials in the briefing document when we were briefing students about, okay, you've got your peer review, week 8, right, this is what it entails, this is what you do. don't stress. It's about enjoying the assessment. This is professional practice. And we'd always have a slide. This is what previous students would say. And we had another slide where I'd say, this is what students with lived experience of disability would say. So if you've got concerns, come and talk to your tutor. We will work with you. We don't want this to be stressed. It was all about how we framed it. And most often they would opt into the group sessions based on those testimonials. They were gold.
Excellent, thank you. So there's another question that is about the model, but I thought Mollie might have some comments about it. One of the challenges might be that there could be a risk of collusion. An advantage is that it advocates integrity and ownership. This question comes from Julian Ong, or this comment. And this is part and parcel behind the motivation behind WIL and a drive to shift emphasis on written assessments. And Mollie, I thought you might have some thoughts around the balance of those.
Yeah, I mean, it really goes to that earlier comment, which is, with Gen AI, there's been a shift on security and assurance of learning, but we can't let that ruin our educational experiences. Obviously, we need some of that to make sure we maintain the integrity behind our degrees and so on. But education and learning is messy, and security is not all there is. And I know a lot of people also are very against group work. I think there's a lot of bad design of group work, but there's also a lot of good design of group work. And these risks of collusion or students, scraping by or relying too much on tools or so on, the same could be said of any staff member in any profession really as well. So that's why it's so important, actually, I would argue, to give students the opportunity to test themselves in these more independent, sort of responsibility-laden contexts so that they can get ready for it when they graduate and nobody's watching them anymore.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in there, Mollie. I just want to clear, this is not group work. Students are not working in group. They're presenting to groups, but it's their own work that they have to prepare and present, and then they have to answer those questions, because I know someone else thought, oh, it's group work. I'm like, no, it's not group work. They're just presenting in groups.
Great, thank you, Faith. I actually had a sort of follow-on question to that as well for you, which is, you shared a couple of examples of things that you overheard as you were walking around the room. And I guess what it raised for me, I guess it's kind of a two-part question, is around the size. I think you mentioned that the groups can be between 2 to 5 students working together, and that made me wonder, well, how many groups are there around the room that the tutor is circulating around? And related to that, how do you sort of juggle the fairness related to, you happen to overhear this conversation that either brought somebody's mark up or down, and how do you manage that?
Well, that's where the peer review forms informed the tutor marking, because obviously you're not going to hear every presentation exactly. And you might hear a great question from someone and miss a great question from somebody else. And that's why those peer review forms, I tried to drop them in the chat, but I can't. So I'll email them and share them. That's why those forms were so valuable, because the students had to think about what they were writing about each other. They had to share what their question was, how happy they were with how their peer answered that question. And then they gave an idea of a mark. So you're actually getting quite a lot of information from those student forms. And we even tossed out throwing out the mark and just have commentary. But we decided to keep the mark in because it helped inform the tutor's marking. But you're getting quite a lot of information along with the artifact that the student presented as well. So you've got a PowerPoint and feedback right there, along with your own observations. So ultimately, you might have gone, they didn't handle that very well. It's still up to your academic moderation of those marks and all those artifacts and what you observed.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And I'll just note that you had added through a conversation in the text or in the chat around the time then that each tutor has to pull together all of those pieces. Go ahead.
Yeah. So we just At the time, we had a policy of 15 minutes allocation for marking, which everybody in this room knows is absolutely not enough. But that was the institutional policy. So that's what we paid tutors to mark. And basically, we had a 2-hour tutorial allocation, and those groups were based on however many students you had in your tutorial. So if you had 25 students in your tute, you're looking at, around about 5 groups of 5. And if you had 30 students, you've got stragglers, 27 people don't show up on the day. That's why we had a minimum of 2 and an average of 5 just to get through everybody.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. So I notice we're finding ourselves a little bit short on time. I wonder if both of you might like to address the question, if you could change one thing about how institutions approach will assessment, what would it be?
Oh, that's a tough question. Mollie, I'll throw you under the bus.
Oh, geez, I don't know if I have one. I mean, I suppose what's really important, moving forward is that constructive alignment about thinking about the learning outcomes and whether the assessment is doing that. I think Faith's model is a good example there where, I don't think you stipulated what the specific unit learning outcomes are, but I can imagine that they're around that evaluative judgment and being able to apply a critical lens and so on. And I think that's probably the most important thing moving forward, even more important than security or non-security or all that jazz, is really just making sure that we are connecting our learning and the intended of that learning to the assessment.
I think I would go back to a position that I always have about institutions, higher ed institutions in WIL, and that is that I don't believe that higher ed fully appreciates the value that WIL brings to a student experience or the amount of time and work it takes to deliver a quality WIL course. So when we're asking about if I could change anything, I would say for institutions to start measuring how much it takes to deliver a quality WIL course and allocating appropriate resources in order to do that. And I know that doesn't really answer your question, but I know a lot of us here are spending time and hours and emotional labor on our students that we're not appreciated for or compensated for. So, if I could change something about WIL assessment, I'd love for them to actually value what a WIL course does and help us provide better authentic assessment for our students so that they know how to articulate their experiences, they know how to evidence their experience, and when they walk out of our university doors, they're confidently going into careers that we've helped prepare them for.
Thank you both for great answers to a big question, a very big question that we could spend the whole hour on. We do have another couple of minutes before I was going to start wrapping up, and there are a few things that have come in that I think a lot of people would be interested in. Faith, this one is for you. The question is from Anita Dewey, and it is, first, thanks for a great model. How would you suggest we prepare neurodiverse students beforehand, particularly in a fully online course? And if I could just broaden that a tiny bit to not just online and not just neurodiverse, it occurs to me that all of the peers need some guidance for how they give feedback.
Yeah, so that pastoral care, Anita, was a huge element, and we did have a lot of students expressing concern. The beauty of online is that it allowed us to bring in elements, accessible elements such as closed captioning. We could, as tutors, place students strategically with other students in the groups that we knew that they would be quite well supported. But a lot of it had to do with our briefing. That's why I said earlier, it's so critical that we're reassuring students that this is not a scary assessment. And I understand that some neurodiverse students did have higher levels of concern, but honestly, it was really those testimonials, because we always ask students the next week to reflect on their experience. We'd get them to fill out a form. Those testimonials were valuable because they could see what other students were saying about their experience. And they could see other students saying, I really enjoyed it. I was really afraid, but I actually enjoyed it more than I thought I would. I actually got a lot out of this experience because I could see how it was helping me develop skills I'd need in work. So that we had a lot of those comments, and we did a lot of framing around, this is not a scary assessment. This is you presenting your experience to your peers and colleagues in a professional manner. So I know there were issues, and we did have accessibility and neurodiverse students, but it really came down to pastoral care, appropriate placement, and that high level briefing. We put a lot into the briefing session because we really wanted students to go in feeling okay.
That's great. A really helpful response. Thank you, Faith. So before I start with the wrap up and the thank you, I'm just going to mention that the next thing that we'll do is take some screenshots. So anybody who is willing to be part of a photo for LinkedIn, would you please turn your photos on, image, video, whatever we call it, on? And while you're doing that, I will also do a cue for all of our professional learning people here. If you can scroll to different pages of the photos, so we get photos from different pages. And with that, I would like to extend a huge thank you to Mollie and to Faith for taking the time to share your knowledge, your insights, your much research and the experience that you have gotten delving into these issues that we're all benefiting from. So thank you for making the time for us. I have also posted to the chat just a minute or two ago, but it's possibly gotten buried, the link to upcoming WIL Australia events. So please have a look at that and come along, register to our future. We're just getting the calendar set up for this year. So there will be more and more events populating, but we have a couple coming up in March and in April. And I'm not going to spend too much more time on thank yous, but I do want to thank Heather and other members of the Professional Learning Committee who are here, who make these events possible. And with that, let's all get a smile on our faces and take a couple of screenshots. Okay. So thank you everyone for making the time to be here. We had almost 500 people registered for this event, which suggests that the interest in assurance of learning, what we do in the age of AI and assessment, and some specific models that we can apply in the space of WIL is of huge interest to everybody in our community. So thank you all for being here. And again, thank you to our presenters.